First, a quick outline of the program. Lucila and I will begin by introducing ourselves, Lucila first. Then I'll say a few words about myself, and more importantly, I'll try to frame the paper, which got more and more dense as I continued to edit on it. I was approaching a list of 10 aphorisms in the final stages of editing, but didn't get quite that far. And then as a way of starting off the conversation, Lucila and I will talk for a bit about the questions the paper raises. And then for various reasons, which I'll try to explain, but very much in keeping with the project, and our project director, Ted Smith, is here. In keeping with the customs of the project on the future of theological education, we'll have a musical interlude. I spent an enormous amount of time making these selections. It was a great pleasure to do this. And we use these interludes in the project for various reasons. You can scribble thoughts or frame questions or meditate, or given the music we'll be playing, you can recall lost loves. It's a perfect occasion for doing that. And then after that, we will open the question more generally and hope that it is indeed a conversation rather than just a question and answer. So Lucila, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Lakeisha, for having me here. It is a wonderful thing to be among you and to see the names in the chat, not only of friends, but also of people whom I've admired from afar through their writings. So it's a great honor to be here. I am Lucila Crena. I am the titles you know. I think some of the relevant things that I'd like to share with you is that perhaps one of the things that I bring to this context is that I am a teacher who's learned to teach in a very different world, which is out of the Central American context for Latin America. And so many of the questions that I bring tend to be from contexts that are not traditionally represented in the academy. And I say that to say, I am so glad to be here. I am so glad to hear your questions, and I will be thankful for your grace as I meander through my questions, trying to place myself in this world in which you are. So thank you for the hospitality of having me here. Mark.
Thank you, Lucila, for being here. As you've heard, Lucila and I and Ted have been working together with a small band of colleagues on a project about the future of theological education. Whenever I would come back to a meeting and explain to my students that I had been in a meeting about the future of theological education, someone would always remark, those must be short and depressing meetings. But they were not. In fact, they were joyous and creative meetings. But whatever the project does or doesn't accomplish, which is out of our hands, I've been deeply impressed by Lucila's sensibility about teaching, by her intuition for what we can do to open classrooms and other teaching situations, for the tremendous range of students who arrive hungry for learning. So I asked Lucila to join us because I knew that she would hold me accountable. She would hold me to the real, which it seems to me is essential in talking about education. And I expect each of you to do the same. We don't need dogmas about teaching. We need a better practice of the art. Now, let me perform an unusual self-introduction for an academic conference. In fact, I would encourage you to set aside your conference mask if you're wearing one, because I'd like to have a different sort of conversation here. I generally avoid academic introductions. I hate standard lists of accomplishments because we shouldn't teach for honors. I further believe that we have to escape hierarchies of academic expertise to talk well about either Christianity or ethics. You've seen that in the paper. I hope now you get to watch me attempt it on live television. I teach Christian sexual ethics as someone who is counted into a sexual group long persecuted by churches. I'm a person now identified as gay, though I hesitate before that label and indeed before sex gender identities generally. We are still finding or making language rich enough to register the variety of our sexes and genders, and I think we always will be. During some years, while coming out in the middle of the first waves of the US AIDS epidemic, I felt caught by the frightening history of church condemnations. I don't want to forget that history. How could I? It continues around us. But I now look forward to a Christian future that diverse people can inhabit. So I ask basic ethical questions. Who am I underneath or after centuries of violent polemic? What forms of abundant life might be open for me? What kinds of community inside or outside of churches? I'm sure that many of you in otherwise stigmatized or marginalized groups ask similar questions. But here's the thing, it's not just the marginalized that need to ask them. In all of my students across their many kinds of sex gender, I see sex gender wounds, but even more, a hunger for sex gender ethics that nourishes more than it maims. So these basic questions, it seems to me, are questions for everyone. They are. This is not a prescription. This is a description. They are questions for everyone. One of the most hopeful things about the undergraduate course I described for you is the fact that it took place at all, that it happened as it did. An old white man, gay, childless, religious, but heretical by one standard or another, an old white man was allowed to host a space for diverse students to explore urgent aspects of their lives. The situation held many ironies. In fact, at the start of each semester, I would warn the students against old white men in positions of power lecturing the young on sexual ethics. It's the very icon of patriarchy, especially inside what began as a colonizer's school and what continues as an institution devoted to expertise. But I then invited the students to consider how improbable my presence at the lectern would have been 60 or 70 or 30 years before. Perhaps theirs as well. And then I would count off the other kinds of bodies either excluded from Harvard College until recent decades or admitted only under suspicion and according to quota. The bodies present in the lecture hall for a course on sex gender ethics enacted a little story of hope. Just the fact that we were sitting there getting credit for talking about these topics. The paper that I asked you to read attempts to tell that hope while noticing difficulties around it. I did find the undergraduate course hopeful, not least because of the astonishing work that many students were able to do in it. But this course also showed difficulties or temptations for students and teachers alike. In the paper, I focus specifically on the temptation to knowingness, because I think it threatens both to hamper ethical teaching and to damage embodied lives. I say that without pretending to comprehend classroom knowingness or my own knowingness or their relations to larger structures of power over sex gender. Writing the first half of the paper was another effort to grasp what really happens in that undergraduate class, especially around this felt compulsion to know in advance all the answers. In the paper, I spend more time with the undergraduate course, which was not framed as religious ethics, except in the sense that any discussion of sex, gender in the United States must deal at length with religion. But I think a long meditation on the secular teaching of sex gender ethics is a necessary prelude to the teaching of Christian ethics. Christian ethicists must appreciate the current complexity of sex gender languages and cases and issues. They must try to discern what students formed in that complexity need and how it can be offered to them respectfully. But they must also recognize the ethical harm around us as the wreckage of Christendom. You can't start to teach Christian ethics until you recognize how much damage has been done in the name of Christ and Christian institutions claiming to be his churches. And the damage, it seems to me, is worse for sex gender than for many other ethical topics. Not the worst, but it is worse in sex gender than in many other areas. That is why I begin my seminar in Christian sexual ethics by asking whether its future isn't a question rather than a certainty. What is the future for Christian ethics? Yes, but is there a future for Christian sexual ethics? However we diagnose the present prospects of different churches' teachings, we cannot convincingly begin by assuming that we Christians have a fixed ethical system and the only trick is to figure out how to communicate it. We cannot convincingly assume that because in the US at least, we are surrounded by the debris of Christian ethical systems. Let me go further. If we can somehow get past the wreckage, I still don't think we will be able to make persuasive claims to expertise in Christian ethics for sex gender. It will always be preposterous for Christians to claim comprehensive expertise about that aspect of embodied living. Our obligation is rather to dwell in what I call a necessary humility about our own incarnation. In the paper, as you know, I connect us not only with Jesus's riddling teaching or its silences, but with the promise in his bodily resurrection, which teaches us that the maturity of human bodies lies beyond death. We're always adolescents in the present life when it comes to our bodily experience. Instead of trying to complete an ideal code of law, then, as if we were already resurrected, we should do much better to follow after basic questions about embodiment, vulnerability, intimacy and harm, love and power, redemption after brokenness. Christian sexual ethics doesn't begin by asking, what can I do before I get married? Though that's a kind of classic ethical question about sex. No, its opening question should be something more like, how do I love in a created, mortal, someday resurrected body? We don't need a specialized sexual ethics so much as a generous ethics for being incarnate. And we can't assume that we already have the right form for such an ethics, which is why I keep asking undergraduates and graduates, what do you expect sexual ethics to look like? Let me conclude by restating, Christianity proclaims that the incomprehensible love of God is revealed in our flesh. You would think that such a proclamation would lead to a robust, joyous practical formation for the loves of sex-gendered human bodies. But when it comes to sex, Christians have typically brandished an aggressive code that leaves many wounded. Shouldn't the followers of a wandering healer treat tender bodies more lovingly than that, otherwise than by code? But enough about me. I wanted to start now towards our general conversation by turning to Lucila and asking, Lucila, what do you think?
What do I think? I think at first that this is not fair, because I read your paper and I have to wander around it and circle it several times, and then here you simply frame the paper and I want to wander around and circle your remarks once again. But first, I'm thankful for you, Mark, and for the ways that you invite me where I am, beyond the refusals in teaching and towards the yes and the hopes in teaching. So, as you know, when I first read your paper, I wanted to subtitle it "Against Knowingness," and that is a fine subtitle, maybe. But the more that I read it, the more that I saw in it the affirmations of what we make room for when we seek to disrupt knowingness. And so I hope that as we speak, I'll share some things that came to mind. I'll share some questions, but I hope that as we speak, that that is what I'm laboring to articulate for myself, the yes beyond the refusals. Because, as you also know, I want to first, before I join fully in the choir celebrating your paper, I want to acknowledge some of the attractions, the temptations of codes. For bodies that have been subject to aggressive codes, it is a real temptation to create our own aggressive codes back. These aggressive codes have been used to police my body. I now want to use these aggressive codes to police men's bodies. Right? So, to paraphrase someone else's, I've heard this somewhere else, but it's not my story, so I'll just share without attribution. Now that we minoritized sexually in some way, are finally coming to power. Now you want to get rid of codes. I want to keep that expertise for myself. I think one of the beauties of what you offer us is that you say to us, the codes were always fictitious. The codes were always going to flatten and to kill. And so to lead us into relationships with one another that were violent because false. And so I think about, I was reminded today of John Hassett and Hugh Glacier, the editors of Towards Society That Serves Its People. This is a book that Ted shared with me. And in their introduction, they're articulating the principles of liberation theology, and they say to grasp the real, in one case, to grasp the real, or to address the real, one must seek what is possible given the constraints of the actual, right? To grasp the real or to address the real, one must seek what is possible given the constraints of the actual. And I think that you are inviting us to think about a pedagogy that that seeks to address the real, to save, to heal, to bring towards wholeness, within the constraint of the actual, without falling prey to the lure, the temptation of codes, that actually will not deliver on that healing. I'll leave that for now to see if you have a response.
No, I think that's right, all the way around. And one of the things that I've been struggling with myself is and I've been struggling both conceptually and personally in terms of my own formation. I mean, you can't spend decades reading Thomas Aquinas and not feel the attraction of codes. Although my main argument about Thomas's ethical teaching is that it's actually an anti-code. It's against codes. It's about ethical formation, not code. And it's taken 7 centuries of twisting, snipping, and rewriting to produce a neo-Thomistic code. But I agree with you. I think we have to begin by acknowledging what I would call the fantasy of the perfect code, and then to ask what do we imagine the code is doing for us? I mean, why do we fantasize it? And here I think of 2 really different voices, both of which I'll paraphrase badly. One is Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick saying at the beginning of her Axiomatics, people are really different when it comes to sex, right? Some people like sex a lot, some people don't like it at all. So, and then she just keeps going to try to sketch out the difference. I think that difference is deeply challenging to us. We want someone to tell us how to be sexual or how to have a gender. We want a prescription. And I would connect that with a slightly darker remark that Leo Bersani makes. Again, I paraphrase badly, which is, he says at the beginning of an essay, I'm going to tell you a great secret. People are really afraid of sex. For all the talk of pleasure, desire, seeking, lust, people are really afraid. And I feel that fear myself. And I try to open space in the classroom for that fear to find voices among the students. Because I think one of the things knowingness does is it covers over our fears so that we feel comforted. Yeah, let me stop there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's one of the yeses that I saw in your teaching, that I think you say at one point, generous, that you pay generous attention to whatever is sincerely expressed. And I wonder, as one of the virtues of good teachers, if we have dared to pay generous attention to whatever we sincerely express as teachers, to pay attention to what comes out of our mouths, not as measures of our expertise or as signs of our great reasoning or of our regulatory expertise, but that what comes out of our mouths might be something that reveals us, and to pursue that revelation with humility, in a pedagogy that tries to teach among equals. Now you talk about that, about teaching as if you were one of us in the wandering community, and you also inhabit and you teach about strong teaching methods that don't lead to abuse, but that where actually the teacher takes responsibility for being an ally to the student's desire to know and cultivate it. And I think your battle against knowingness is one of the ways that you ally yourself to your students' genuine desires to know. How do you inhabit a sort of a strong pedagogy that also that where you take the responsibility of being an ally to your student, and you refrain from being from entering into abusive relationships of power. How do you see that difference? I think I see it in your examples all throughout, but do you have a way that you say to yourself, here's how I'm keeping myself to pedagogical methods where the students need to trust me, right? Where and also where I become worthy of their trust, where I know myself to be worthy of their trust as they need to walk alongside me.
Well, Lucila, I think, as I would expect, you've put your finger on one of the most difficult pedagogical challenges of this kind of course. I mean, on my optimistic days, what I would say to myself is that that one advantage of having an old white body, gendered male, that has certain types of academic titles draped over it, is that I can use that body to block the door of the classroom, to keep out all the forces that are attempting to compel the students to speak in certain ways, right? So I can use my body as a kind of block against institutional forces, institutional expectations. And that may just be a self-serving kind of imagination. But I agree with you that the more difficult issue is not what I'm doing, as it were, on the outside to try to keep certain powers away from the classroom, to try to create an open space. The more difficult pedagogical challenge comes in the in dealing with the students as an equal, as another human being. And there it seems to me that I have to be, any teacher has to be absolutely honest interiorly about what's going on. If I'm feeling very angry towards a student, why? What am I feeling? If I'm feeling that a particular line of questioning is one that I want to break off and redirect, not because it's a waste of time, but because it makes me uncomfortable, then I have to ask myself, what's going on here? And there were some delightful moments in the class when students would catch me, not in an "I got you" mistake, but there was, I won't remember the case clearly enough, but we had read a paper about, it's one of the first papers written on sexual violence in what we would now call the internet. And finally, after a lot of sleuthing, they traced back the character, the avatar on the internet to a men's dorm at an institution in New York City. And it turned out to be the work of a group of young men rather than just a single person who was doing this. In recounting the story, I forget, but I mangled the details in a certain way. And one of the students raised a hand and said, but wait, wasn't the story like this? And I said, oh, you're absolutely right, sorry. And the student said, but then why did you get it wrong? And I said, because our fantasies work all the time, because I had imagined it in a way that made the group more culpable from my point of view. I had told the story in a way that demonized them a little bit more. And it seems to me that kind of exchange, even in a large class, which this was, has to happen. The other thing that that really was important was that I had a group of teaching fellows, teaching assistants for the class. And because the class was so large, there were usually 8, 10, 12 teaching fellows for it. And we met every week just to talk about the teaching. Not to sort of decide on the line we were going to follow and so on, but just to talk about the teaching. And after a while, the teaching fellows took me at my word when I said, if you see me doing something that's not productive, tell me. And they began to tell me, right? And those were not always comfortable, but immensely useful conversations. I think I learned more about teaching by teaching that class than from any one single class.
I was going to ask you, how do you interrogate your own anger or your own desires to cut off a line of questioning? But I think you just given one way of doing that, to have people that you equip and empower to narrate that for you, to speak that to you, to ask you the questions that that you need to have answered. I'm not sure how much more time we have. I think about 5 more minutes probably.
Yeah.
I wanted to move to a different question and a different line. And as I was reading your essay, a parable came to mind. And it's the parable of the dishonest steward. And I kind of like it as a larger frame for some of what you're doing pedagogically. And so let's say we are the managers. We, especially teachers in the humanities, professors in the humanities, that we have been found by the rich men who employ us to be really squandering their property. We are not producing the managers, to put it in terms of some of our institutions' missions, the managers of the world that we are tasked with producing. And so we see our numbers dwindling, we see ourselves in a difficult position in the humanities. But that, we still have some time left. We still have some riches left. We still have some resources left as educators. And I'm wondering what if some of what you're doing here is not inviting us to squander fruitfully the wealth that has been granted, to say we are going to, specifically in this course that required regular displays of reasoning and some assignments from philosophical texts, you did that. But you cut in half the debt that these students had to learn the codes and become expert managers of the codes. And you instead made room for writing and generous and courageous witness and dancing, perhaps. So yeah, this just makes me think of ways that we might reconsider our teaching, and the riches that we still have now, even as we see a more dire paradigm, dire prospects for our profession. And I wonder what you might make of that.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you for the gift of that reading of the parable. And let me just say 2 things really quickly, and then we can get on to a couple of more important voices in the music and then the general conversation. The first thing is that it seems to me that both the historical origin and the deep ethical core of the doctrine of tenure is freedom of teaching. It's the old German university notion that you get to choose, that a full member of the faculty gets to choose what is taught in that faculty member's course. I deeply believe that, And what I try to do is to also take a little bit of that teaching freedom and distribute it as much as I can to the class as questioning freedom in the group to ask questions that lead the course in particular directions. Yeah, and that's the other thing, that whatever the curriculum says, whatever the requirements for a course are, once you draft the syllabus and get the students in and close the door, what's going to happen is what's going to happen. I mean, right? The students have questions of their own. And so this course, I was cautioned repeatedly, because after all, I'm a divinity school professor, not to proselytize, right? They said it more pleasantly, but don't bring in religion, don't bring in religion. And what I found is that after I made my initial kind of secular sounding comments about needing to talk about religion, because if you don't talk about religion, you won't understand the history of sexual ethics in a country like the United States. It turns out the students had all kinds of questions about religion that came up week after week. And all we had to do was exercise our freedom to follow them. And all of a sudden, the course began to move. The course itself danced right across the boundary of philosophy, law, and religion. And that great forbidden topic, the religious, was allowed to come in. And as I said in the paper, the astonishing thing was I had people coming up to me. So I had people coming up and said, after reading Plato's Symposium, I had no idea the Greeks thought this. Could you give me some other texts about this? But I had people coming up after we read just short selections from the Hebrew Bible and saying, I've never read any of the Bible before. I've never read it. And so this course became, as I said, an occasion for first readings. And I would say forbidden first readings. Yeah. Anyway, yes, we should turn over to the to our singers. But thank you, Lucila, for thank you as always for your reaction. Let me just say a few words before I ask our tech wizard to cue the songs. The last time I taught the graduate seminar on Christian sexual ethics was in fall of 2020, which meant Zoom, pandemic isolation, national elections, and so on. To top it off, several seminar members were just emerging from bad breakups. And as we struggled with the more severe Christian sources, one group of seminar members decided that they had to do something to cheer themselves up, that the course was just becoming too relentlessly depressing. And after a bad breakup, they were not in the mood to be further depressed. So they started making musical playlists of popular songs appropriate to a seminar on Christian ethics. And soon the rest of the seminar pitched in. And it seemed to me that this turn to popular music was entirely appropriate for a seminar on sexual ethics, because I think popular music may be the most widely circulated teaching on embodied love that we encounter. And it's astonishing how widely certain particular songs travel. But the music also reminded me of how we used musical interludes in our work for the Theological Education Project. We used it to pray, but also most often to write. And that's what I would like to suggest to you, that you use this music to think, to scribble questions, but also to let your mind wander. Because, dear friends, when it comes to love, all kinds of bodies can inhabit the canonical languages, as we're about to discover. So 2 songs about stages of infleshed love. I think of them as before and after. Each blends musical styles, each crosses borders, and each offers lessons that have been taken up by bodies with very different kinds of desire. But listen for yourself. And if you want, you can turn off the camera and dance.
Can one say after that? I have to confess that it was difficult to think of questions for Mark after hearing Santa Cecilia and Whitney, because I wanted to refer to them as my teachers and ask you about their lessons for sexual gender ethics, but I will refrain for now. Thank you again for being in this conversation. It would be now our joy, Mark's joy, to continue the conversation with you all. And the way that we will proceed is if you would please put your questions on the chat, would be one way to do it. If you would like to raise your hand, we can also do it that way. But perhaps a better way would be to put the questions in the chat so we can keep track of them as they go. So I will give you a few seconds to think of your questions or to write them, to raise your hand, and we'll proceed with the conversation. Mark did say to me several times, and I'll get in trouble, I think, if I don't say this, so far as one gets in trouble with Mark, that what we would like to do is to have a conversation about the topics that the paper raises. This is not a conversation about the paper itself, although it's a site for our shared question and answers. Any questions then? Okay, let's see. There's all the questions coming in. So Daryl Stevens asked, can you say more about power dynamics in the classroom? Daryl, I think maybe you might want to unmute yourself and tell us the context for your question.
Sure, thank you. I'm curious about, I mean, you mentioned some of the power of being a tenured professor and the freedom that gives you to follow the conversation or to allow the conversation to develop. Also curious about asking students to disclose things about themselves and their sexual narratives, and being in a position of power and asking someone to make themselves vulnerable in that way. How do you navigate those power dynamics as a as a teacher?
Thanks, Daryl, and it's great to see you. I'm very careful actually about ever asking students to write about their own experiences or to talk about them. In fact, I've often, there were a couple of times in the large lecture hall setting. So we had a large lecture, which was about 160 students. And then we had small sections, which were about 12 students. And there were times when people volunteered information in the large lecture hall, and I kind of winced internally because I thought they were making themselves vulnerable in a very large public setting where we had no guarantee of confidentiality. I was clear about that from the beginning. I mean, I asked people to be respectful of one another and not to report things said in class outside with attribution, but I had no way to enforce that. So I was very cautious about that. And what kept surprising me was that at a certain point in the semester, say halfway through, people were comfortable enough with each other to begin volunteering information. Now, I still left out, there were some students for whom it was important to say, you don't have to write about yourself or you write about your own experience or talk about it. You can talk about a friend or a case you heard, or, so I was always trying to open doors for maintaining privacy. The other thing I'll mention is I think there's certain bodily aspects that made it possible for me to teach this course when I was older than 60. And that would have made it harder for me to teach when I was 40, say, because the students could regard me as a kind of grandfather figure. And so they accorded me that kind of generous, sweet trust, I think, that's often given to those who skip a generation, who are further along. And that I regarded as unearned authority or unearned trust. They gave it. I was astonished that they gave it. But about the other aspects of power dynamics, the fact that I was a tenured professor, that we were meeting in the middle of Harvard Yard. Harvard is a very hierarchical institution. The students are schooled in a kind of deference towards senior faculty members. All of that I would name, but I would never try to pretend that it didn't exist, right? So it seems to me it's important to be absolutely candid about the realities of institutional power differences.
Thank you, Mark. I just want to name this, Tracy Lamont offers a strong affirmation of the way you embody your pedagogy, in that your students offered music as a response to what they were learning. So it's a powerful example of how students can co-create the curriculum when we allow them the freedom to do so. And then Mary Hess asks, what have you found are practical ways to manage the challenges of seeking to support open knowing in an institution that is dedicated to expert knowing?
Oh, Mary, that's the question, isn't it? And at various times I became very melancholy about the limits of my ability to resist the institutional logic, which was the inevitable backdrop of our class. So there were moments when I became aware that no matter what we did in the class, the students regarded the class as an exception and thought that as soon as they walked out the door, they had to become a different sort of person in order to deal with the institutional reality. So I think you're naming something very deep. And I never felt that I had solved the problem or that I even knew how to make sure progress with it, except to try at every moment to show another way than the way of the power of expertise. And so if that meant saying in class, I don't know, right? I would very often turn to some of my TFs or to other members of the class. For example, around legal questions, we would always talk about the historical variability of age of consent laws, which are still extremely variable in the United States. They vary by state. And very often the student would ask a question and I would say, I don't know. And then I would turn to the TF or to a student I knew was from the law school and ask the question so that I would, there again, it's easy for me to do because I was relatively little at risk. I wasn't an untenured professor trying to establish my credentials. But I didn't feel afraid to admit ignorance in the class. And also sometimes students would ask me questions where I didn't have an answer, but I wanted to emphasize the importance and difficulty of the question. I wanted to commend the question to the class as a question that we should be sitting with, especially if we didn't have a ready answer for it. Yeah, but I agree with you. And my worry about the future of the humanities is that the prevailing institutional logic will become more and more unfriendly to challenges to expertise. And that will mean, I think, that we need to find either little air bubbles in the institutions within which we can do the other work, or we have to find other homes for doing this type of work.
Mary Elizabeth Moore asks, Mark, what has nourished you into a generous, humble, deep listening pedagogy?
Oh, Mary Elizabeth. First of all, I wish that I felt that I had gotten to being a generous, humble, and deep listening teacher. But I really mean that, because my experience of my own teaching vices is that in some way I'm still struggling with the vices that I had when I was 25. There's certain deep-seated propensities that have to be corrected kind of week by week. But let me turn the question just a little bit, because I think it goes back to this question of that's been lurking about communities of accountability, or the communities for which we do our work. And the one thing that I never felt in that class was that the work was unimportant. On the contrary, I felt that the work was deeply important, and important not just to the education, but to the lives of the students. And that in that sense, I was held to my best teaching persona, or to my best teaching practices, by the importance of what we were doing together. And if I began to slip, I mean, I did have to teach Thomas Aquinas. And when I start teaching Thomas, I enter that other expert part of my brain, and I can go on for 15 minutes about the exact textual variants that occur, et cetera. And whenever I would start to slip in that way, I could see the reaction on the faces in class, and the faces brought me back into, no, this is not about my expertise on Thomas Aquinas. Yeah, but thank you for that question. Can I just say too, that one of the things that I already feel in this conversation, and that I felt all along in the project that Ted has led, and led very pedagogically, I should say, is that I wish we had more opportunities just for supporting one another as teachers, right? Not professional exchanges, those are wonderful. Not here's my latest research project, do you have any ideas about it? But just in the core work of teaching, if we could find more occasions to ritualize our support for one another.
Amen to support, I agree. So Mark, our next question comes from Rochelle Green, who is a senior fellow also in the Theological Education Within Times project. And she says, in the paper, Mark asks, what hope might Christian theology offer to current debates about sex, gender that is not offered better by others? I am wondering, Mark, what you think about this as it relates to teaching overall. What hope might Christian theology offer teaching that is not offered better by others?
Yes. So Rochelle, let me just say again, I feel this particularly around teaching of Christian sexual ethics, because I think for various historical reasons, which you all know, the Christian churches have been playing catch up with other forms of knowledge about sex, gender for at least 200 years. And so it seems to me what we don't want is for Christian sexual ethics to be warmed over versions of what was said 50 years ago by progressive sociologists or progressive psychologists about about human sexuality, human lives. But you point to something more more urgent about the state of theology, which is its sense of belatedness. And I mean that in two ways. The first is just that we are really living in the wreckage of Christendom, which means that as soon as you start talking about Christian topics, everyone yawns and says, oh my God, I've heard this before. I've heard it for 15 centuries. Like, really? Are you going to offer us that? But the other sense of belatedness is the sense that in our effort, let me just be blunt. In our effort to gain intellectual respectability, especially within larger universities, we are constantly imitating what we take to be the intellectual standards of the more successful disciplines. The problem is that we don't imitate them very well. And the other problem is that they actually don't fit very well with what theology is trying to accomplish. So I think we should just declare ourselves contrarians and just recover a certain theological boldness. I think of something Ted Smith said to me many years ago when we were together at Emory, and he was talking about this effort by humanities professors to catch up with the latest educational technology. And he said, but they never really catch up. Like they're always a few technological generations behind. So the student's reaction is, well, nice try, but actually your software is out of date. And that, I think, is kind of the more general rhetorical situation of theology when we put ourselves in a situation of trying to chase after what we take to be the real discipline. So whether that's mathematical physics or statistics or whatever.
Thank you. Our next question is from President Boyoung Lee. So following up on Daryl's question about power relations in the classroom, have you experienced vulnerability and unpreparedness as a teacher because students were too open and willing to share personal experiences?
Yes, Boyoung. Yes, absolutely. And that's a particularly interesting moment for me, pedagogically speaking, because it's a moment in which in some way the roles reverse, or the traditional roles reverse. And I'm all of a sudden having to deal with my own sense of embarrassment or ignorance or just emotional rawness. For example, I know that I cannot talk about AIDS in the classroom. If I begin to talk about that, I usually start crying within a couple of minutes. So I'm pretty careful to keep that at arm's length. But there are times when students just bring it up with a kind of directness, an absolutely sincere directness. When a student asks, what was it like? It was horrible. It was horrible. It still is horrible in my memories. And there have been times actually when I have involuntarily started to cry in class around these issues. And the astonishing thing to watch is how many students, as soon as the class is over, come running forward to see if they can be of help, right? Or how many students will say 5 years later, that is the moment that I remember from that class, that moment. One other sort of example, of course, that also happens to me when someone brings forward an example of an experience which is very far from my own. And this can happen along any of the measures of diversity. I just wrote an email to a former doctoral student of mine who is Korean, and I apologized to her for my abysmal ignorance of the history of US intervention in Korea, of what it actually meant. I mean, of course I knew there was a Korean War. My father was almost reactivated in the reserves to serve in it, but I didn't understand what that war was for Koreans. And I just wrote to her to say, I'm so sorry. I just had no idea when you brought forward certain stories, the context out of which they came. And I regularly feel that in all my classes, not just in the sexual ethics classes. One of the privileges of teaching at a school that attracts many students from outside the United States, or indeed many students from different parts of the United States, is this extraordinary breadth of experience that's in the classroom, so much bigger than me, so much bigger than I could ever comprehend. And when that experience is offered, it's completely humbling.
Our next question comes from Olaf, who is a graduate student at Loyola New Orleans, MPS. He asks, Professor Jordan, would you please elaborate on the phrase, professing faith in bodily resurrection should make Christians less knowing about human bodies, including their sexes and genders?
Right, Olaf, thank you. I mean, Christians in liturgical traditions profess belief in bodily resurrection every Sunday and on major feast days. And I don't know what we think we're saying when we profess that, because in fact, we know almost nothing about our own bodily resurrections and only a little about the resurrection of Jesus. But what we are professing in some sense is that our fulfillment, our teleology, our ethical end is in bodily resurrection, about which we know nothing. And we also believe, at least this is one traditional teaching, that Jesus was born with human genitals, a complete human body, if you want to use the word complete in that way, and rose from the dead with them, as a certain statue of the resurrected Jesus in Rome makes all too clear. And there's a bit of gossip which says that you can tell what how conservative the next pontificate is going to be by whether or not the fig leaf reappears on this statue, right? So we know these things, but we don't know them. We profess them, but we don't think about them. Because one thing that does suggest to me is that the role of sexuality, the role even more deeply of gender, of having a gendered body, in all the complications that it can have, that is something that's tied up in eschatology, right? It's tied up in the resurrection from the dead. And that ought to make us very humble about professing that we understand human embodiment, sexed and gendered human embodiment, because at the best, we're waiting on a revelation to understand what that might mean. So that's what I was trying to get at. I can say that sometimes I say in class, and though I try to be a little careful with these truly scandalous remarks. Sometimes I say in class that Christology is actually a long gallery of Jesus's corpses, because we are so afraid of his living body. We are so afraid of his living body that we flee from it. And I think this is one aspect, this question of sex gender is one way in which we are particularly afraid of Jesus's living body. And I'm not presuming anything about his sexual desires or his sexual life, or whether he had one, or what his orientation. I'm not getting into any of that. I'm just saying we're just very afraid to even think that, to even begin to think that. But we have to begin to think that to do theology.
I have a comment and then a question. So Kathy Winings, I imagine might be the way you pronounce that, your last name, says, I worry that it will take something like a near-death kind of experience for many to recognize what is most important in our life, the ability to authentically and genuinely love people before moving behind doctrinal sayings and theological pronouncements or beginning theological debates. The older I get, I am reminded more and more through the process of living that this is what we are called to do, love.
Yes. Yes, and amen.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a question from Ted Smith, who writes, you write that the form of teaching ethics is often the deepest teaching of ethics that happens in a class. Yes, you show us this even as you write it. Sex, gender are also embodied in our teaching, and the way we teach might be our deepest teaching about sex, gender too. I have in mind not just the performance of gender roles, though surely that, but also what it is to work with the eros that can be present in deep teaching and learning. All this you know, and to the extent that I know, it is because you taught me. What do we do with this as teachers? I have some sense of how to embody ethics in my teaching, but how do we work with the erotics that course through teaching and learning? And what can we teach about sex, gender in the form of our teaching?
Ted, I'm tempted to call time and say it's a lovely question, but we just can't get to it. But no. I'm not going to duck, not quite so obviously. One of the mysteries about teaching for me is its physicality, is the fact that it's an embodied performance, and that our students often know much more about us than we think, because they're attuned to what's being communicated by our bodies. I had several students, when I finally came out, I was teaching at Notre Dame, several students who came up to me and hugged me and said, I'm glad you finally figured it out. And I thought, no, actually I knew before, but how did you know? And the answer is because they had spent semesters watching me move and speak and react to things. So I agree. I think that teaching as an embodied activity communicates all sorts of things about our gender, about the comfort or lack of comfort with which we inhabit assigned gender roles. And then there's the problem that we live in a moment where for very good reasons, people are extremely cautious about the abuse of sexuality in relations of authority and trust. And I want to stress, for very good reasons, people are worried about that. And we all have known situations, both egregious and not so egregious, in which there has been a kind of bending or twisting of the erotic energy in a way that is not good. It can happen in very subtle ways, as well as in the more egregious cases. But look, I'm still enough of a Platonist and a frequent enough reader of the Christian mystical tradition to believe that our pursuit of God is powered by desire. It's powered by this deep created desire that constitutes us in our core. And one expression of that desire is erotic, or one way to talk about that deep desire for the divine is erotic. And I think we have to tap into, or at least acknowledge, that desire when we're teaching about God or when we're teaching about anything serious. I don't know if you need to tap into desire to teach Principles of Accounting 101, but I do know that in order to teach most philosophy, for example, you have to recognize that the texts are trying to elicit your desire. The texts are trying to draw your desire. And for the most serious teaching, I think what we call trust, the trust that's established between teachers and students, I think that often has its origin in the kind of desire or a kind of affinity that takes place. And here again, the worst thing would be to pretend as if that's not there, or to pretend as if it's not happening. That doesn't mean, or that doesn't tell us how to resolve questions about what happens when a student comes into your office and says, I love you, right? It doesn't tell us anything about that difficult sort of negotiation that has to take place. But I do think what it does is suggest to us that merely attempting to turn off desire in the classroom, attempting to pretend that there is no desire in the classroom because it's too anxious for us, that's not going to work. And in fact, in my experience, it's going to explode. If not this semester, then next semester, or 5 semesters from now. I mean, haven't we seen that at great length in the ongoing church scandals about sexual abuse, that the denial of the presence of desire is what makes desire most explosive? Yeah, so thank you for the question. When you figure it out, would you let me know, please? with that, I should call time because we need to say our goodbyes and then to give the last word to Lakeisha. I just want to say thank you all for being here. We all are zoomed out, but thank you for putting up with that Zoom fatigue to be here. I would be happy to continue any part of this conversation by correspondence. You should be able to find my mail address on the HDS website. But if not, it's pretty simple. It's mjordan@hds.harvard.edu. And especially if you've been sitting on a question which will absolutely rock and topple my argument, I would be most gracious to hear that sort of question too. Thank you, Lucila.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you to you for your generous invitation to the rest of us in this conversation and the ways that you have modeled new ways of relating to one another, or not new, but rarely expressed ways of relating to one another. And I would encourage you to write Mark just for the pleasure of receiving a Mark email, because they're each work of art. Thank you, Lakeisha, for this invitation. Thanks to the technicians who have played the music for us. Thank you, President Boyangui, for having us here. It's been a real pleasure.